Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Fortin. I'm the host of this podcast, Doers Within Emerging Markets. And I just want to share my experience with using Anchor so far. When the pandemic started, I thought about starting a podcast, and the whole idea was to bring in some really amazing folks that are doing some great work in their respective industries within the emerging markets. And the Anchor platform really helped me get the word out there and also just make it a lot easier for me to invite the guest and just share the amazing experiences they've had and the amazing work they're doing in their respective industries within the emerging markets. So it's pretty fun. You don't even worry about the technical part of making a podcast. You actually just focus more on the content. And Anchor has done it really well for me. So I will highly encourage anybody who is trying to start a podcast to try to use. Just check out Anchor, and I think you won't regret it. I'm not a technical person, but if you listen to these episodes that I've been publishing so far, it seems like I know what the technical part of it, but Anchor helps you take care of the technical part, and you just focus on the content. So feel free to check it out. I highly encourage. You won't regret it, and it's right there. You don't pay anything. So in times like this, I think starting a podcast and getting the word out there, irrespective of what you're doing, will be a really great experience. So thank you guys for listening to my episodes. Please check out Anchor, and you will have a great time. So cheers, guys, and see you guys next episode. Thanks. Okay. Hello, everyone. So welcome again to Time for Emerging Markets, Doers Within Emerging Markets. I'm honored and humbled to have Alexandre Lazarow. I hope I got that right.
Lazarow is perfect.
Yes, and he's the author of this really great book, OutInnovate. And since when the book came out, I just came across it on LinkedIn, and so far I'm just pretty amazed by the amazing content that other people have talked about the book. He also has a newsletter that comes out as well that kind of summarizes some pieces of the book. But I think this book actually, is a book for our times, and it actually provides a very good framework of how we think of emerging markets. But I'll give it up to Alexandre to kind of introduce himself, and I will go into the nooks and crannies of this book. So welcome, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Happily. And first, thank you so much for having me. Excited for the conversation. And I'm a big admirer of your podcast and the conversation that you're really starting around doing things in emerging markets, because that's really why I wrote the book. So by day, I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in startups all over the world. The fund I work at has offices in Asia, in Europe, in North America, across Africa. We also have a presence in LATAM. And it's really providing a horizontal platform to support entrepreneurs wherever they are. And outside of work, I teach entrepreneurship at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which is Middlebury College's graduate program. And in both of those situations, I was getting really frustrated. And I was frustrated because I always wanted to share content and best practices and thoughts about entrepreneurship, but everything that was available was invariably rooted in a time and a place, Silicon Valley and today, and for a very particular type of asset-light, software-based startup that wants to scale extraordinarily fast. And yet what's happening around the world is that entrepreneurship is globalizing.
Yep.
In 2013, you would have been right saying all the action was in the Valley. 4 startup ecosystems around the world had created all billion-dollar businesses. Today, that number's flipped. 85 startup ecosystems have created billion-dollar business. There's over 480 startup ecosystems around the world. And they're operating in ecosystems that look different, that have less capital, that have less depth of trained startup capital, that might face more macroeconomic shocks or what have you.
Yep.
And in those contexts, what it takes to build, scale, and succeed just looks different. And I don't think anyone was talking about what it took and channeling the lessons of these best entrepreneurs around the world. So I decided I would. I interviewed about 200 entrepreneurs from across the emerging startup ecosystems, many emerging markets, but also areas in developed markets that are developing startup ecosystems. And I think that taken together, their lessons offer us a new playbook on innovation, from which we can learn.
Yeah, sure. That sounds really amazing. I think I'll go into the book a little bit later on. Just to go into a little bit about, just to take a step back, can you just tell us where you grew up and, kind of what led you to where you are right now. Just give people like a journey of how you started and how you end up where you are now, writing the
Yeah,
book.
happily. All right. Well, so I've always been passionate of the intersection of economic development, innovation, and the lens I have now of investing being one approach, but that wasn't always the one I thought I was going to do. When I was in undergrad, I grew up in a small town in the middle of Canada called Winnipeg. When I was in undergrad, I thought I was going to do a PhD in developmental economics.
Oh.
And I had the opportunity to go work on the Canadian version of Wall Street in the big city of Toronto. And I realized that actually I loved the tool of finance. I wasn't in love with selling Canadian insurance companies, but I thought that financial services could be an incredible tool to have impact on people's lives. So I decided to do my MBA instead. And this was during the time of impact investing and the beginning of that movement, and where microfinance was really scaling and succeeding. And so I came out of that thinking I was going to do some version of innovation meets investing with the impact overlay. I realized I had no discernible skills. So instead of going straight into that, I postponed it. I had the opportunity to work at the Bank of Canada. Many of the industries I'm focused on are highly regulated, so I want to understand how the government thought about it. And then I also worked in consulting for a number of years across many emerging markets. And with those two experiences, I then had the opportunity to work at Omidyar Network, which is the family office venture fund, impact fund of Pierre and Pamela Omidyar. Was there for about 5.5 years, investing in financial inclusion startups around the world. And about 3 years ago, I joined my current employer, Cathay Innovation, another global platform to support entrepreneurs everywhere.
That's very diverse range of experiences. That's really inspiring. So now you're at Cathay Innovation. Can you tell us what Cathay Innovation does, and how is your job like a day-to-day experience of your job? Like, if you can share a little bit about that?
The day-to-day being a venture capitalist?
Yes.
Yeah, it is the best job I've ever had.
Really?
And honestly, if I didn't have to work, I'd probably want to do this, maybe less hours, but this is the kind of work that I really like, because it's a combination of three things. And one is I get this incredible opportunity of working alongside entrepreneurs. I've never been an entrepreneur, but I've had the great fortune of serving entrepreneurs and writing about them, et cetera. And I think these businesses are really shaping scalable solutions that will change people's lives, and being part of that journey in my little way is something I'm personally excited about. I think the second one is William Gibson once wrote, "The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed."
Exactly.
And I think that being a venture capitalist gives me the opportunity to meet a lot of entrepreneurs building the future in their particular area, and it gives you a really interesting perspective. You step back on what that's about. And I think the third, it's a really fun team building, kind of social, interactive, thought-inducing, thought-provoking job, and I just feel pretty fired up all day doing this job with my colleagues. So I love it.
Awesome. And just as a VC, was there anybody along the way that kind of inspired you or kind of gave you some guidance to say, this is something that, someone you looked up to and say, hey, this is something that I want to do, or you intern for? I'm just curious about that. Is it something you just like, when you found it on your way, or you had a mentor that helped you to get where you are?
So I think that when you look at someone's career, it might look linear in retrospect when looking backwards, but in reality, it never is. And a lot of it there's a lot of points in your life, big points where you're making big changes, when you decide who you're going to marry, all those kind of things. And then there's small points along the way that shift the course of what you're doing. And so I will say it's really important to have people to consult on the big shifts, but also people that you can be thought partners along the way on the smaller ones. One of my mentors at McKinsey once told me, the best companies, the best entrepreneurs have boards of directors. Why shouldn't people have boards of directors? And what he meant by that is have a group of people that you trust, that you are inspired by, or that can help you. And they might not be the same people you ask for every single problem, and they might not even know that you're on your quote board of directors. But it's people that you can call and ask for advice and build a relationship with. And I don't think there's one person that I could say, but I can name you 5 or 6 that helped me in very, very critical ways at different critical junctures in my life. And so, if I was going to give advice to some of your listeners, I would say, think about that. Like, who's the set of people you can call? And it's a little bit of a roster too, depending on what the problem is and how you're thinking about it.
Exactly. No, thanks for sharing that. I think it's very important. I think most of the people who listen to this podcast are young, graduates, just finished an MBA program, trying to get into the finance space, and having that perspective can be really helpful. So going now into the book, this amazing book, and I can tell you have been doing really well with the book. I see it everywhere. I saw you actually wrote a Harvard Business Review article, right? And so, I mean, it tells me that, it's very, there's a lot of well received, it's well received, and, the reception has been pretty good from my perspective, look at it from the other end. So you mentioned earlier that, Silicon Valley has been, for years now, been seen as the center of innovation. And based on what the work you're doing at OutInnovate, and just, mentioning how you were teaching in school and you had this frustration. So can you just tell me, or tell our audience rather, how this ecosystem has shifted out of Silicon Valley? Like, tell us what was happening that kind of led you to say, okay, we have to think out of Silicon Valley, which probably to write this book.
So first, a remark on your comment. I appreciate that that sentiment. Book launched April 7th, which is arguably the worst day in history to launch a book. It was the particular day that the most people were under lockdown at home, the most globally. And second, Amazon wasn't even shipping books, so book launch to Mark was a little bit of a misnomer. But it's actually the reception's actually been very strong. Yes. And when I started writing the book, it was this belief that what I took to scale startups outside the Valley looked different, and we needed to share that playbook.
Yes.
And what I learned was, yes, that's true, but also there's a lot the Valley can learn about it too. Yes. The world shifted in the last year, right? But between I handed in the manuscript June 2019, we launched in April, and we're now in 2021, right?
Yes.
And since then, we've gone on lockdown. Since then, there's been less capital and financial shocks because of COVID and what have you. The strategies of these global entrepreneurs are more critical than ever, right? How do you actually build with a foundation of sustainability and resilience, something that's par for the course outside the Valley, is now a strategy that people have to do. How do you build distributed teams? Something that people did out of practicality. Now everyone has to do it. And those role models don't exist in the Valley. And so in some ways, the book's become more relevant than ever, and also to Silicon Valley. So I think that's interesting. On your point, on your actual question around what's happening, it's easier than ever to launch a startup today. It's called Silicon Valley because it used to be silicon. You had to have chips and you had to servers, and it was incredibly expensive just to build your product because you had to install everything. Now you can rent a supercomputer by the hour on Amazon Web Services. You can have an ultra modern retail front end on things like Shopify that often dwarfs anything the biggest retailers could build internally. And so that's causing this Cambrian explosion of entrepreneurship around the world. And with it, a funding, that's a lagging indicator, but I think it's going to accelerate. And that's what's happening right now. But these entrepreneurs are building an ecosystems that still look different than the Valley. And that's one of the reasons conversations are so critical. And when you talk to the founders of the most successful companies, their stories, their ways of going to battle to build these incredible companies, they'll just tell you, man, this looks so different. And some of these are disadvantages, some of these are advantages. It goes both ways, but it is also different.
Yeah. And one word you mentioned in your book, you said Camels. And it's such an interesting word that you mentioned for entrepreneurs in these emerging markets. Can you really explain that to the audience? And I actually see that also on like most of your articles, it's phrased as, we need camels as entrepreneurs in emerging markets. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, so before I tell you about camels, let me tell you about unicorns. In Silicon Valley, the term unicorn is really attributed as this, technically means $1 billion business, but it comes with a lot of baggage. Like, it's a philosophy on how you build startups. And if that's the philosophy, the method is growth. It's growth at any cost, where it's okay to have unsustainable unit economics in service of growth, where it's okay to burn lots of money in service of growth, where it's okay to take a short-term perspective in service of growth. And outside the Valley, I just don't think that makes sense. And so I talk about this camel approach to building startups instead. So first, why did I choose a camel? Besides the fact that everyone in Silicon Valley needs to have a camel, an animal. So I chose the camel to communicate the idea. Unlike unicorns, they're real. And when times are good, they can sprint across the desert. They drink water faster than any other animal in the world. But when times are bad, they can survive. And by the way, they exist in many ecosystems around the world, and they are one of the most resilient animals in the world. And of course, camels are also looking to build big businesses, to be billion-dollar businesses, taking the literal translation of unicorn. But they do it in this different way, built on sustainability and resilience. And so it's underpinned by sustainable unit economics, managed burn, long-term approach, et cetera. And I think that strategy yields better and more reliable scaled businesses over time across a wider set of ecosystems.
Yep, that's pretty amazing. One thing that I also kind of saw how you said, you said frontier innovators sometimes need to build full stack. What can you just tell us a little bit about that?
This is another example where it is harder to be an entrepreneur at the frontier, but it also confers some advantages. And the full stack refers to the range of enabling infrastructure you need to do to be able to just offer the main product. I talk about this company, Bolso, in Brazil, which is essentially a personal finance manager. Think mint.com for the Brazilian market. But in the US, it's pretty easy to build that, right? There's Yodlee and Plaid, makes it really easy to connect into other people's bank accounts. There's a pretty ready fintech market that is willing to pay for leads. So it's easy to monetize. And while FICO and the credit scoring agencies are not perfect, it's a pretty good indicator of someone's creditworthiness for loans and other things. In emerging markets, it's totally different. In Brazil, when Bolso started, there was no Plaid. They had to build it themselves. And there wasn't even a credit scoring infrastructure. You're either in the blacklist on default or you weren't. And there wasn't really a fintech market. And so Bolso had to build the connections, build a way to explain creditworthiness, and even build a white label offer on their platform as well, as just to offer the core product. And that's what the full stack means, is having to do a bunch of this enabling infrastructure just to offer the final product. But it also confers some advantages. And one of them, for instance, I think is a moat. The mountain is that much harder to climb, but if you make it to the top, it's also that much harder for everyone else. And so it's a challenge that also confers an opportunity.
Definitely. I mean, I can really see. I mean, there are some indications that, I mean, what you're saying, you clearly elaborated in your book as well, like how that is actually the right model for even people at Silicon Valley to learn from frontier innovators, right? You asked a quick question here. What do you think are some of the lessons that people from Silicon Valley can learn from these frontier innovators?
Yeah, they're myriad, because, by the way, Silicon Valley seems like a homogenous approach to building startups, but even within the Valley, there's a lot of heterogeneity. I just think part of that market has just been ignored in service of the venture, like the heavy blitzscale kind of part of the market. And so I think that there's a range of things that some entrepreneurs in San Francisco can learn across the board, but very tactically, this approach of being a camel is required when there are tougher macroeconomic shocks. And if you're built on this unsustainable foundation and you effectively get on this merry-go-round adventure where you continue to grow, and because you continue to grow and subsidizing some of the unit economics, you'll also be making the whole much more painful. And so you'll need more VC to be able to continue going down that merry-go-round. It becomes hard to flip the business model. So I think learning on that dimension. I think around distributed teams is really powerful. This is something that in emerging ecosystems where there isn't the same depth of talent, and I believe that talent is distributed evenly, but just opportunity is not. And there isn't this whole army of been there, done that folks in startup land. People build distributed teams, tapping folks wherever they find them. And that's a muscle on how to build a culture, an organization, a product that looks different. And so it's no surprise that when the whole world went to remote through COVID, people were looking at companies like Basecamp out of Chicago or Zapier out of Missouri to understand how they were doing it, because they've been doing it all around and they've been doing it for practicality. And so I think there's a variety of these vectors that I cover in the book, where I think not only can global entrepreneurs learn from each other, but the Valley has a lot to learn too.
Can you just share some two main takeaways that you hope entrepreneurs in emerging markets or investors who are investing in emerging markets take away from your book?
Let me give you three. I think the first is
sure.
the frontier and Silicon Valley look different. And that's a really important, it seems obvious, but that is actually an incredibly important point that people don't appreciate. Two, I believe the future of innovation is going to be at the frontier. There are now 480 startup ecosystems, 1 million venture-backed startups, 85 ecosystems have built $1 billion business. And actually, by the way, these aren't just the big businesses. They are the biggest. The biggest ed tech business of the world is in India. The biggest neobank in the world is in Brazil. The biggest robotic process automation came from Romania, and the biggest super apps are in China. So the future is going there, and we need to learn what's going there. And the third is, if we ignore the valley, if we ignore the frontier from the valley, we'll be in trouble.
Yes.
An analogy to this story is the automotive industry. 100 years ago, the capital of innovation wasn't Silicon Valley, and the technology wasn't software. It was Detroit, and it was automotive. It was cars. There's hundreds of entrepreneurs building car companies in Detroit. Fast forward, what's happened? The future of automotive industry is global, and the best place for raw engineering is in Germany, and the sexy sports cars come from Italy, and the cheapest cars are made in India with Tata, and the capital of electrification is arguably Silicon Valley or Shenzhen. And the same thing is going to happen to technology. Silicon Valley is going to still remain an important place, just the way Detroit is too. But we're going to see specialization. We're going to see places like London continue to become a powerhouse in fintech, or Estonia in e-government, or what have you. And that's going to continue accelerating. So the Valley and the world needs to learn from this emerging best practice too.
That's amazing. That's amazing. There's a lot that, I taken from this, and I think my listeners will really appreciate just what you said. How can people get to you? I know you write some really great articles. You're on, I see on LinkedIn, you have a very good online presence. How can people reach out to you? And most importantly, how can people buy your book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So my book, OutInnovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley with Harvard Business Review Press. You can buy it anywhere books are available. It's on Amazon, but given the crisis we're in, I'd really encourage you to support your local bookstore and buy it there. And then in terms of following me, you can feel free to sign up to my monthly newsletter at alexlazarow.com, ALEXLAZAROW.com, or follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter, Alex Lazarow. And we'd be happy to stay in touch. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really fun discussion.
It's so great to have you. And just one last thing, what's next for you? Are you going to write another book, or are you going to?
Since having the launch of the book, I also welcomed a baby daughter who's now about a year. So I think what's next is taking care of her for a while and trying to be a great dad.
Yeah, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening to Alex, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye, guys.